Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIKS. I'm Yeonho Kim, Associate Director at GWIKS. Thank you for joining our North Korea Economic Forum panel discussion. The forum is part of the policy program at GWIKS and aims to promote the understanding of North Korean economic issues, distribute well-balanced, deeply researched, and multidimensional insights on the North Korean economy. Today, we are discussing how North Korea is managing its economic crisis. And four experts will assess the pandemic's impact on the economic these indicators and the direction of economic policy in North Korea. And they will also suggest the indicators to watch for whether North Korea's economy is in a major crisis or if it is muddling through. Let me briefly introduce today's panelists. Bradley Babson is former chair of the DPRK Economic Forum at the U.S. Korea Institute, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He serves on the World Economic Forum Council on the Korean Peninsula, the Advisory Council of the Korea Economic Institute of America, and the steering committee of the National Committee for North Korea. Our second speaker is Ulchul Lim. He's an associate professor and the director of the ICNK Center at the Institute for Far Eastern Studies at Gyeongnam University in Korea. He also serves as a member of the Policy Advisory Committee for the President for South-North Summit, National Security Council of the Blue House, and the Ministry of Unification in South Korea. Min Chao Choi is a data correspondent for NK News and NK Pro, where she tracks North Korea's shipping, aviation, and mirror trade data to provide insights on the North Korean economy. She also covers cybersecurity and investigates North Korea's business networks abroad. And last but not least, Rachel Minyoung Lee is a non-resident fellow with 38 North at the Stimson Center, and former North Korea analyst at Open Source Enterprise. For 2 decades, she analyzed the gamut of North Korean issues, including leadership, domestic politics and economy, foreign policy, and internal stability for US policymakers and Korea watchers in Seoul and Washington. And before we start the discussion, I'd like to remind the audience that we are taking questions from you, and the Q&A box is already open. So when you type in your questions, please make sure to identify your name and affiliation. And I'd like to remind the audience that we are providing simultaneous interpretation service today. So when you look the bottom of your screen, there is a button for the interpretation, simultaneous interpretation function. So you may want to click on the English option so that you can hear the interpretation from Korean to English. With that, let me start with Min. Let's deal with the first topic, our first topic, economic indicators. So Min, North Korea has been taking extreme precautions in dealing with the pandemic, including sealing its border with China and tightening the control of the movement of people and goods. So how serious is the impact on people's market activities and the market in North Korea?
Well, it's very serious. And also I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm very honored. So I'd like to share my screen just to show you and our audience some of the trade data that I've managed to accumulate from Chinese General Administration of Customs and also from Russia's Foreign Customs Service. So I'll share my screen now. And I hope that looks okay for all of you.
Good.
Okay, perfect. So what we're seeing here is actually a rather old chart for me because it only goes until October 2020, but I included it as my first slide to show just how much trade has fallen by both volume and value over the past year or so. So the beginning is January 2017, and that sparks the year that sanctions were first imposed. Well, the toughest sanctions on North Korea were imposed by the UN, which happened around August. We see trade begin to, especially imports from the DPRK, so what North Korea is sending out, immediately begin to decline, and it never really recovers. That's because the UN sanctions targeted big money makers like coal, seafood, and iron and other metal exports. But we see that Chinese exports to the DPRK are still strong, and actually they even increased in 2019 by 30% year over year from 2018. So we see that at least up until the beginning of the pandemic, North Korean and Chinese trade was running smoothly, running well, and China was taking up the majority of what constituted as international trade for North Korea. It was estimated around 90 to 95%. But now we see in the 2020 period that it's gotten almost to near zero numbers. And actually the next slide will make that a lot clearer. So this is comparing 2019 to 2020 and 2021. And we see North Korea's lockdown in terms of trade. It's not a hard lockdown because minute amounts of trade still got through. But in March 2020, which is the first indication in where we have in trade data the lockdown occurring, we see an immediate crash. GWIKS did something incredible. It has never included 2 months in 1 month's worth of data in its entire history, but the pandemic hurt Chinese trade so much that this data point disguises how bad the crash actually probably was in February, and we only see that manifest in March. Then we see like limited amounts of trade coming in. As I was tracking this, it was mostly food and other strategically important items like medicines. And then at around August 2020, we see the second lockdown occur, which North Korea has not really recovered from at all. There hasn't been a policy that indicates that more trade is coming through. A common critique of Chinese GWIKS data is that it doesn't capture everything, which includes smuggling, illegal or unofficial trade. But to be very honest, it's alarming and disturbing to see such a drastic change compared to just a year ago. And as we can see in January and February 2021, which is the latest data that we have, North Korea is not even accepting almost zero imports from China. They don't want to risk exposure to COVID-19 and sending very small amounts of exports out to China in order to make up those funds. And just talking about food specifically, because food really affects, I think, what most people in this room care about, the Korean people. Food exports also crashed during this period. We can see this is comparing 2019 to 2020 and 2021. Again, I'm going to show you just 2021, so it looks a lot different. But we can see food exports rising, especially through that kind of like golden period between the first crash and then the second crash, or the first lockdown that happened around probably February 2020, and then the second lockdown, which happened around August. So really large rises in strategic imports of food, and then just huge crashes. One-time purchase of sugar in January, and almost no other food imports since. And this is, again, comparing it to the previous years where food imports were actually incredibly consistent. And something that the North Korean government, if not relied upon, it can't produce its own sugar, and it can't produce its own luxuries like cocoa powder or palm oil, or things that we would just think of as part of a regular modern diet. And these are things that they were importing and don't have access to anymore. And to address a second part of your question, do we really think it's as bad as it seems, or as bad as it could be? I think saw last week that North Korean leader Kim Jongun called for his officials to brace for a more difficult, arduous march, which is probably the most explicit thing you can say in terms of comparing a hard situation to a situation of literally famine and people dying. So I think when we look at this kind of data and combined with official statements from inside the country, we are seeing something quite desperate.
Thank you, Mincha. What about the people? I mean, obviously they're facing a perfect storm now. How are they addressing these unprecedented challenges?
Sure. One of the few insights that we have are NK News has some sources, mostly inside of Pyongyang, and the reporting we've been getting out of there is that even in Pyongyang, it's difficult to buy food in its shops. And these are like very privileged places to be where it's, oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. These are very privileged places to be where it's uncommon for scarcity to be encountered, and yet we see that. And then also there's actually a plethora of Chinese videos on the internet, on websites like Bilibili or Aishikwa, or even YouTube, where Chinese YouTubers will go to the border, specifically Hyesan. There's a really great like vantage point looking into the Hyesan, from the Chinese border looking into Hyesan, and you can see market activity occurring. You can also see when there are like soft lockdowns occurring because of the absence of people in the streets. And this is just, the vantage point only shows like a certain part of the city, so of course it's not everything. But in terms of how the people are reacting, as long as I've been covering North Korea, which is actually not as long as almost everyone in this room, I have never read reporting where people protested and actually had their voices heard. But in terms of Hyesan being forced into a lockdown, at least I think it was about 2 months ago, that there was general outcry in the city that there wasn't enough time to prepare, that people weren't able to get food. And officials lifted the lockdown after 2 days, which is astounding in a state where public demonstration and the officials listening to that is really unheard of.
I see. So probably the people in the border area are mostly impacted by the current crisis. We don't know whether the inland people are, you know, going through this crisis, but we can discuss this further down the road. Let me ask Rachel this question. Why don't we move on to the official economy? So what are the noticeable damages to the state's economic management and projects so far?
I think limited hard data makes it difficult to accurately assess the impact COVID has had on an already frail economy, but as Min has just shown, I think there is enough to say that the lockdown has had a major impact. Kim Jong has mentioned of carrying out another arduous march at the latest party cell secretaries meeting was definitely a notch up from the more prevalent term, which is self-reliance. And I think it reflects the current difficulties and the leadership's desperate determination to tide over the situation. And in terms of examples of how COVID has had an impact on the economy, there's no evidence to suggest that North Korea's economic situation is nearly as bad as it was during the arduous march in the 1990s. But I think the status of North Korea's major construction site project alone does speak to economic difficulties aggravated by border closures and to some extent the floods last summer. For example, the Wonsan Kalma coastal tourist zone and Samjian construction projects, which were major multi-year national projects, remain unfinished. The Pyongyang General Hospital construction project, which seemed much more manageable scale-wise compared to Wonsan Kalma and Samjian projects, also has long passed its original due date, which was October 10th, 2020. In terms of state control over the economy, economic discipline and order and the rule of law in the economic realm were all themes that North Korean state media had consistently emphasized after the Hanoi summit collapsed and as Kim Jong-un started bracing the country for a long period of self-reliance with no sanctions relief. And mounting economic pressure following the national lockdown made it that much more critical to strengthen state control over the means of production, products, and the distribution of products to ensure that A, the people's basic needs were looked after, B, that economic development proceeded in a planned, systematic manner, and C, reforms stayed on their intended course.
Oh, Yanho, you need to unmute yourself.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, my bird was chirping, so I just had to mute, but thank you, Rachel. Let me ask this question, the third question for Brad. Brad, let me ask you to focus on the fiscal and the financial impact North Korea is facing. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I would say this last year has been devastating for the finances of everybody, the state, enterprises, entrepreneurs, market vendors, household. Everybody's been significantly impacted financially by what's happened over this last year. And this is similar to many other countries that prioritized lockdown and protecting the health of the people over the economy. And it's just a more extreme situation in North Korea because of the border closure, the sanctions, the loss of remittances, the loss of tourism, all of the things that have given them financial input from abroad has been a major contributor, more so than in most countries. One of the most dramatic indicators of this was the projected revenue increase in the national budget that was announced in January of the Supreme People's Assembly, which is normally an annual event where they indicate what they expect the revenue of the state will be. This year, it was in January, it was projected at 0.9%, which is the lowest projection in decades in North Korea. And it compares with 4.3% they projected for 2020 just a year ago in I think March or April. So that's a major public admittance of the impact financially of the pandemic combined with sanctions on the financial expectation of the state. And I think that this reflects, at least on Kim Jong-un's part, a willingness to be more honest about the reality of the finances affecting the state than they may have been in the past when some of these projections were a little bit hard to believe in terms of reality. But this projected revenue increase is also reflected in parallel with what they are projecting for the transaction tax collections of only 0.8% and the profits of state enterprises of only 1.1%. So across the board, at the beginning of this year, there was a signal that the state understands and expects there will be significant financial curtailment of what their previous expectations were. I think another important indicator is the depreciation of the market-based exchange rate of the US dollar to the won, which was holding steady at about 8,000 won per US dollar for many years, surprisingly stable, but it's now trading at 660 won. And similarly, the RMB exchange rate has depreciated from about 1,300 a year ago to about 880 today. So this depreciation is really important because I think it reflects the impact of the border closure on the trade with China, as we've seen, and what this means for the demand for foreign exchange holdings for market transactions. But what the depreciation has done is it's lowered the value of savings that are being held by households and enterprises in foreign exchange at least until the border situation closes and the demand for foreign exchange for normal commercial transactions rises again. But for those households and enterprises that have been using dollar and RMB holdings as a safety net against uh, their need for future resources, and with a lack of trust in the government's management of the yuan, remembering back to the currency confiscation effort in 2009, loss of trust. But people who are holding their savings in foreign exchange have seen about a 20% loss in value, just at the time when the cost of goods and services in yuan are increasing because of the other pressures that we've in the marketplaces. So that's a real hit for both enterprises and households that have been using foreign exchange holdings for their personal interest savings. But of course, foreign exchange is really needed for essential imports, whether they're legal, still legal, or through sanctions evasion. If they're going to get ship-to-ship transfers of oil, how are they going to pay for them, kind of thing. And this and I think that the estimates that I've seen of foreign exchange reserves held by the government domestically and in various forms abroad, that the value of those reserves, I think, was sort of maximized around 2016, but since then they've been dwindling, and it's not at all certain that they have significant external financial reserves to pay for the imports. We saw that gap between imports and exports in 2019. I think that was chewing up an awful lot of their reserves, and that may not be the situation now, and that would add to pressure that we're seeing in their expanding their cyber theft operations and efforts to extract private foreign exchange savings from enterprises and individuals through the calls we've seen recently for more loyalty payments. The bond initiative taken last year, which was unsuccessful, but was trying to do that, obtain more foreign exchange from both state enterprises and the Donju, and the increased efforts that are now being integrated in their new management system for more financial transparency and tax collection structure from enterprises, private businesses, market vendors, et cetera. So, and we've heard briefly about the sort of the impact in the general markets with reduced market hours, less availability of consumer goods, higher prices, much higher prices in the markets now for corn and pork, particularly, smaller portions of street foods with higher prices, efforts to curtail grasshopper vendors but confiscating their supplies. All of these kind of developments, which are anecdotal, signal that the financial stresses for market vendors, consumer households are quite severe at the present time. And lastly, I'd like to say that recently there have been indicators that the market prices of various commodities are increasingly different in different markets of the country. Up until recently, the prices have been relatively stable in different parts of the country. That's no longer appears to be the case, and it obviously is probably linked to distribution problems within the country now, moving things from one area to another. But this adds to growing inequality, not just between Pyongyang and the rest of the country, but different parts of the country compared with each other, which is, I think, a relatively new development that signals those kinds of stresses. So I think in conclusion, I wanted to say that I think this past year has really underscored a reality that North Korea has a very underdeveloped fiscal system for what is now a mixed economy. And these institutional weaknesses add to the financial strains facing all levels of society through a very limited ability to use fiscal and monetary mechanisms to help manage and alleviate the shocks to the economy that the country is now facing. If you can imagine, if North Korea had the ability to send everybody a stimulus check, they do it, but they don't have the ability or the finances and the institutional capacity to provide support to the people in the ways that we are experiencing here at home in the US.
Thank you, Brett. So it's obvious that the North Korean people are, feeling the huge impacts at every corner of the economy. And I'd like to ask Ulchul these questions. So do you think North Korea is overreacting, the government is overreacting to the pandemic? Why do you think Kim Jong-un has been taking these extreme precautions? And do you see any reasons other than the public health concerns?
잠깐만요. 김정은 위원장이 코로나19에 대한
Yes, Chairman Kim is reacting to the COVID-19. Whether he is overreacting or not, well, I do agree with you that he is a little bit overreacting to the COVID-19 situation. However, when I was studying North Korea, when I was studying over Kim Jong-un for a long time, my personal take is like this. Chairman Kim Jong-un is a reasonable person and he's making a reasonable reaction. Chairman Kim is trying to secure the safety of the residents, and he believed that the citizen safety is more important than the economy. And between the two, whether it is a quarantine or the economy, for the Kim Jong-un, the top priority is the quarantine and the security and the safety, even though at the cost of the economic development. And he wants to prevent the entrance and the expansion of the COVID-19. That's the belief of the Chairman Kim Jong-un. And Chairman Kim Jong-un has been consistent on this. In the past, when there was a kind of the pandemic or the epidemic diseases, he made the same reaction. In North Korea, they made a very nimble reaction and the quarantine was really swift and effective in the past. So in that vein, I would say Kim Jong-un, I think he is doing his best. Of course, recovering the economy is really important. However, once again, the top priority is fending the COVID-19 off. And he believes that that's going to make a bigger feat to him. So what matters is when there will be the resumption of the trade between North Korea and China. And I know that you have lots of interest in it, but Chairman Kim Jong-un is intentionally delaying the resumption of the trade between the two sides. It is not the China who is delaying the trade resumption. Actually, North Korea is delaying the trade resumption between North Korea and China because again, his top priority is the perfect quarantine. That's his top priority. The North Korean economy has some kind of the room to go. They are not hitting the bottom yet. Of course, they have lots of difficulties in the economy, but they still have a room to go. They have a room to focus on the quarantine. So their economy did not hit the bottom yet. And one thing we need to focus on is this. Chairman Kim clearly understands the prolonged sanction and the impact of the prolonged COVID-19. And those two factors will pose a significant challenge to North Korea. But Chairman Kim Jong-un firmly believes this is the high time for us to show off the capability of the self-reliance. And this is the high time for us to grow our internal power and the capability to stand on our own two feet without relying on the international or the external support or aid and without relying on the trade with the China. And we don't want to have the COVID-19 again. And we can fend up the border and we can grow our internal power, internal capability for the self-reliance. And his top priority is to have the more power for the self-reliance.
Thank you, Ulchul. I have a couple of questions that I prepared for the first section of this discussion, but we already had discussed that for around 25 minutes. So let's move on to the next topic, unless other speakers have any comments or questions. No? So let me move on to the next topic. So based on what Ulchul said, I think our next question should be this, and I'd like to direct this question to Brad. Do you think North Korea is moving toward a greater centralization of control, possibly returning to a command economy in dealing with the pandemic?
Well, I think building on the last speaker, I do think that Kim Jong-un is a reasonable person, and he is serious about seeking to change the economic management system in the country, both to more effectively guide economic development, because it's been a very inefficient domestic economy, and also to reframe the political economy as he seeks to implement a shift from the military first ideology and strategy of his father to a people first policy that was very prominently framed in the speeches at the party Congress. And I think this effort has been in the work for some time. This is not a new thing that's just driven by COVID. And as we've heard from Chul, Kim Jong-un made the priority decision to put the people's safety ahead of the economy and is paying a price for that. And he is now facing both the two challenges at the same time: how to stabilize things or keep things reasonably stable during this COVID period when everything shut down, and then how to really ramp up economic development in the context of his ambitions articulated in the Party Congress and in the new 5-year development plan once the COVID situation sort of stabilizes. And I think that's a very complicated, difficult situation that he's facing right now. The change that he's trying to introduce, from my perspective, is shifting resources from the military to strengthen the people's economy. And there have been a number of examples of how they've redeployed military forces to be working on domestic projects and other kinds of commercial activity. But also, more than that, just bringing what I would call the siloed economic activities of the party and the military, which have been pretty independent of the people's economy and under management, under a coordinated management of the expanded responsibility of the cabinet, which was being stressed. He stressed that for a number of years, but really made a big point of it in the latest party Congress. And I think if there's going to be more centralized management of all of the commercial activities, regardless of whether they're owned by the people's economy or whether they're owned by the military or party organs, getting more coordinated, coherent economic management of the entire system would be a really big change in the North Korea system compared to its historical one and it's a dicey transition because of the political influence of senior cadres in the military and the party about how all of this transition works in a political economy framework. But I do think that's a direction that he's trying to take the economic management system. And putting as I say, the cabinet being given a responsibility for coordinating the implementation of policies that are really being set in the 5-year plan, articulated by Kim himself, but also adopted by the party with the authority of the party as well as his personal authority. I think many observers think that this will lead to increased state control, but I do not believe the intent is to retreat into old style planned economy management system. I don't think he's trying to go backwards. He's trying to find a way to go forward in new ways that are quite meaningful if he's able to be successful in making these transitions. So I think that, whether they can bring all of this together and to keep everybody focused on national policies and goals and try to integrate them more fully throughout the different actors in the economy, both state and non-state actors, I think is a huge challenge that they're trying to address in these changes. I also don't think, I also think that that he's been pushing for, and there's been evolution over the years to really encourage more decentralized decision-making, both at the enterprise level and at the local level. And what they're really trying to do now is to not give that up, that encouragement of innovation that comes in decentralized efforts to see opportunity and take advantage of it, but to do this within decision-making within legal, fiscal, and policy frameworks that have been set at the level of the National Development Plan and get coherence and avoid rent seeking and other activities that would be considered to be not in line with what the national objectives are and what their national priorities are. I think they still have many, challenges, and two big ones are corruption, particularly the senior levels in the military and the state officials who are not directly linked to the market economy, and this structural problem of the differences in the wages being paid to people who are employed by the state, whether it's the military, security services, et cetera, and those who are people who are earning wages connected to the market economy. And that differential, that separation of compensation is a deep structural problem in trying to integrate what's going on in the market side of the economy with the management of the state managed side of the economy. And that challenge still remains as a longer term issue that I don't think is being addressed yet, or at least I haven't seen it so far. But I do think that the combination of sanctions and COVID-19 make implementation of all of this new effort of reform very difficult in the short term. And personally, it may be true that Kim Jong-un is trying to demonstrate that they can be self-reliant without trading with China, but it won't work. I do not believe that will work. They had a trade, dependence in percentage of trade in the GNP, which was estimated about 20% before the collapse of trade following the UN sanctions in 2017. And I don't think he's going to be possible to get real economic growth moving until they can open up the economy again to trade and investment, tourism, and eventually more reforms of an institutional nature in the financial and legal systems. So I'm pretty pessimistic that trying to close the door and be self-reliant without interaction with the outside world I think that's doomed to failure.
Thank you, Brad. I'd like to ask Ulchul whether he agrees with Brad. You just nodded many times. So.
우리 브래드 선생님의 말씀의
Thank you
상당 부분
very much, Mr. Brad Babson. I pretty much agree with you.
지금 김정은 위원장의 의도를 우리가 잘 파악할 필요가 있습니다.
And we need to clearly understand what is the intention of the Chairman Kim Jong-un. As Mr. Brad Babson mentioned, there are some structural issues in the North Korean economy, which means that Kim Jong-un is working okay. And if Kim Jong-un does not know about the structural issues, in that case, it is really going to be really hard to recover the North Korean economy. As Brad pointed out, there are some structural issues, fundamental issues, and Chairman Kim Jong-un is aware of those issues. So in the 8th Party Convention, he clearly mentioned those structural issues and the fundamental issues. And also in the Central Party meeting, and when he had a meeting with the secretary, he was talking about that kind of fundamental issues. And he talked about those issues in many of the occasions. Whenever he had a party level meeting, he talked about the structural issue, as Brad pointed out. And Kim Jong-un wants to resolve those structural issues. Otherwise, he understands that they cannot make the economic development. Mr. Kim is fully aware of that. And whether he's going to be successful or not, that's a question mark. I don't know whether his willingness will be turned into a reality. Anyway, he's on the right track. He's on the right direction. The North Korean economy has been so segmented, and there are high power people, for example, the cabinet even though it's taking care of the livelihood of the North Korean people, but there are so many the high class and the privileged people, and they are just working for their vested interest. And that is why the North Korean economy was not able to make the development. But now Kim Jong-un wants to make a turnaround, and Kim Jong-un wants to remove the corruption scandals in the high-ranking officials, and he wants to remove the selfish behavior of the North Korean authorities, and he wants to remove that. And that's what Kim Jong-un intends to do. Then let me put it this way. When we take a look at the North Korean economy, and we needed to take a look at the process, how the structural issues will be resolved. But another important factor is Chairman Kim Jong-un is underlining the self-reliance. He's saying scientific and technology-based self-reliance. That's what he's talking about. Science and technology. This is another key word. And there are lots of technical issues North Korea is facing. And North Korea wants to resolve those technical issues based on their homegrown science and technology. When you take a look at the industry, they are currently resolving some of the industrial technical issues with their homegrown technology. And that is why they want to have the trade with China for the technical transactions so that they can further develop their technology and science. There are some issues that North Korea handle with its homegrown technology, and there are some other issues that North Korea needed to rely on China or some other countries. They needed to import some of the technologies, new materials. They needed to import those things out. Only then they can resolve those technical issues. And Kim Jong-un is on track. So let me put it this way. For the economic recovery, the policy direction is reasonable, and I believe the goal is well set. But what matters is whether the road will be bumpy road ahead or the smooth road ahead. That's a question mark. But Kim Jong Un has a strong will to work on it, and he has a strong will. So I personally believe some of the corruption issues will be gone. And for the science and technology and for the homegrown technology. And thanks to the homegrown technology, many of the issues can be overcome. In the past, they were solely relying on China for the high technology and the advanced material and even the fuel and the intermediate goods. However, North Korea wants to take it back to their own hands, and North Korea would like to resolve those issues with their own technology. North Korea is working on the localization and they are working on the recycling and they want to try to produce their goods in their own country. So even though they are facing difficulties, but they are making progress step by step.
Thank you. Obviously, according to Ulchul, North Korea has been creating a new mode of coping mechanism in dealing with the pandemic. Let's briefly look at the historic context, and I'd like to ask Min Chao this question. So as you mentioned, and other panelists also, Kim Jong-un warned his people that another arduous march will be coming on, and how would you compare current crisis to the arduous march in the 1990s? What are the similarities and differences? Would you explain?
Hi, sure. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so my colleague James Fretwell has written a really great article about this on NK News, which everyone in the audience may be able to may be able to access. So my answers will be very similar to his article if you've already read it. But his thesis is that history rhymes, and I think we're seeing it rhyming again. There are a lot more similarities than there are differences. Starting with the collapse of an important foreign trading partner. So in 1991, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. And although it's contested when the arduous march actually formally began, we can say around the mid-90s was when it was definitely being recognized and addressed by the international community. So the idea that the state that had been supporting North Korea as part of the Soviet bloc disappearing and all of its obligations, friendship prices, scientific support, financial or strategic support going away is actually very similar to what we see with trade restrictions as they have been imposed by North Korea on its own borders. So this is not necessarily China deciding to remove its aid from North Korea, but North Korea no longer accepting it because the country is so afraid of exposure to COVID-19. I think that it's been brought up as a concept here in this discussion, but Kim Jongun really derives a lot of success for controlling this pandemic, but that's what that in itself is the reason that explains why the people can endure so much suffering. If he hadn't been successful in controlling the pandemic, I don't think people would accept such harsh restrictions that come with increasing trade restrictions from the country that exports the most goods to North Korea. North Korea relies on China for so many intermediary products and primary goods as well. So in addition to the, let's say, absence of an important foreign trading partner, we also have a series of natural disasters. We had typhoons Bavi, Maesak, and Haishen all target North Korea's east coast in 2020. This is especially towards the southeast of North Korea. And that's actually a primary agricultural spot. So the southern part of North Korea, or maybe the close to the north part of South Korea, is where a lot of agricultural activity occurs. And those were the areas that were probably hit the hardest as these typhoons continued from the equator up towards the Korean Peninsula. And from 1995 to 1997, North Korea suffered a series of floods, and then drought. So we have a series of natural disasters that maybe to us in 2021, people who live in an urban modern society, natural disasters may not hit as hard, but North Korea is a developing country, and that greatly impacts their food production and distribution. Actually, I cover shipping for NK News as well, and I'll show you in a couple of videos after my comments what I mean, but Professor Babson is correct. We've seen that North Korea has had to overcome internal problems when it comes to distribution by taking to the sea instead of sending things overland, because the typhoons really destroyed a lot of internal infrastructure. And speaking of destroying internal infrastructure, the arduous March period also coincided with the collapse of the public distribution system inside North Korea. So this was the system that really allowed the state to distribute food and pay people in like ration coupons or like this kind of barter trade system instead of relying on wages and use of money. And that collapsed during the arduous march, and we saw the proliferation of the jangmadang, the black markets or gray markets, which have slowly been accepted now. And there's not a pressure valve like that anymore. As in, there's no other evolution of a market-based system that you can go towards because it's already been done. So the collapse of the PDS leaves to the markets help and persist even after the arduous march is over. And in this current age, there's nothing else besides the jangmadang because the PDS exists in very limited forms. And people are finding it increasingly more difficult to buy food or other essential goods at the jangmadang because, as Professor Babson mentioned, prices are so high. So it really is devastating for the average North Korean. And then finally, we have a similarity and a difference, the presence of foreign aid in the country. So the Arduous March marked a period in North Korea that really saw acceptance and intrusion of foreign aid groups. And again, their persistence after the Arduous March was over. They provided food aid, infrastructure aid, and also helped the economy get back on track after the Arduous March. And now we see increasingly the foreign aid groups are being pushed out of the country during the COVID-19 pandemic through internal pressure, lack of supplies being able to get through, and then also more overt indications that North Korea doesn't want foreigners in the country anymore because they are either, their explanation is that they're a pandemic risk, or that these groups are able to see the ugly parts of the country that the regime doesn't want foreigners to see, even though these are the parts that need the aid the most. And those are some of the differences and similarities between North Korea's Arduous March during the 1990s and the COVID-19 pandemic now, which we're still experiencing.
Okay. Thank you, Min Chao. Many similarities and differences, and I think we need to really carefully look at those when we are comparing the Arduous March and the current crisis. Rachel, I think we briefly touched upon this issue, but I want to ask you this question. Do you think North Korea's ability to manage the macroeconomy has been improved enough to successfully deal with the current crisis?
Certainly, North Korea's ability to deal with economic crises are very different from what they were during the Arduous March in the 1990s. Since then, North Korea has undergone major structural transformation, going from a rationed economy to an essentially mixed economy. Moreover, a series of reform measures under Kim Jongun, namely the socialist corporate responsible management system, and on the agricultural front, the plot responsibility system has improved North Korea's ability to cope with economic difficulties. That said, I think combating irregularities and corruption, activities that violate the socialist economic management order in North Korea's language, unit specialization, self-centeredness, and abuse of power were all major themes in early 2020. And they remain so to this day, which means these problems remain. Kim Jong-un reaffirmed at the 8th Party Congress that the cabinet responsibility system and the cabinet-centered system are central to the successful implementation of the 5-year economic development plan. So on the one hand, the reference to the cabinet systems signal that Kim's reform policy is still alive. But on the other hand, the repeated calls on the cabinet and call on the cabinet at the various party meetings to improve its guidance and management work indicates that North Korea is not where it wants to be in terms of how it executes its reform policies and oversees the national economy. And the connection, one thing I want to clarify is the connection between the cabinet and the socialist corporate responsible management system. And that is that the cabinet's role is crucial for individual economic units to use the management rights given to them to formulate sound business and enterprise strategies to increase production and expand their business. The cabinet also plays a key role in fostering the socioeconomic environment for implementing the socialist corporate responsible management system and for guaranteeing the conditions for it legally and institutionally. This has been repeatedly emphasized both in state media and North Korea's leading economic journal, Pyongyang. So I think given all the questions about the current state of the North Korean economy and how Kim plans to overcome it, inevitably leads to the question of his economic policy, specifically whether he will maintain his reform policy, particularly in the wake of the 8th Party Congress held in January. And my views are very similar to those of Dr. Babson and also Professor Lim. One important thing here is that formulations like unified state guidance and planning and restoring the socialist commerce system. All of these formulations suggest greater centralization, but are not in and of themselves antitheses of reform. That's one thing that I wanted to clarify, because I think there is some confusion when you see these words that point to more centralization. I think some people automatically mistake them for anti-reform policy. Oftentimes, what North Korea does is it uses these words that seem anti-reform, but aren't really. They just point to greater centralization. They'll use these these formulations with the more pro-reform expressions in the same article. So, for example, many economic articles in North Korean state media and academic journals will simultaneously emphasize unified state guidance and the socialist corporate responsible management system, or preserving the planned economy and encouraging individual economic units to proactively take advantage of their management rights. So what seem to be contradictory terms are oftentimes used in the same mix. So this is just to say, I guess, that just because we see words that seem to point to greater control by the state or the party does not necessarily mean that Kim Jong-un is going back to the way things were before, that he's curtailing his reform policy. A review of North Korean media coverage of the 8th Party Congress and the series of party SPA and cabinet meetings that followed shows that the basic tenets of Kim's reform policy, such as delegating responsibilities to lower units, encouraging innovation, doing away with outdated procedures, and continuing with experiments to improve economic management methods, remain in place. And Kim intends to forge ahead with them with reform, but I think he will seek to reinforce state control to make sure that reform is carried out in a way that's more regulated and in a way that he finds more manageable for the regime, and in a way that he finds to be effective in attaining the regime's goals. So all in all, North Korea seems like it is still experimenting with economic management and is looking to make adjustments in line with what it calls the change in reality. Kim's conclusion at the 8th Party Congress mentioned researching and perfecting economic management methods that accord with our actual circumstances, and bringing together methods that are being researched and introduced on a trial basis. And that indicated that they were still doing experimentation. They were still looking for ways to, hone, revamp their economic management methods. The latest cabinet plenary meeting too, which was held a few days ago, said adjusting the economic work system and order and institutionally and legally guaranteeing conditions favorable to enterprises' business activities. So again, we see language favorable to economic reform, but also language indicating that they may be making adjustments to the way they're carrying out the reform.
Right. Thank you, Rachel. Let me ask this the last question. I think it's a $1 million question to all the panelists. So what are the indicators to watch for, or whether North Korea's economy is in a major crisis or if it is muddling through? Who wants to go first? Ulchul? Yes.
제가 의견을 말씀드리겠습니다.
And let me put it this way.
지금 북한 주민들이 굉장히 지금
The North Korean citizens and the residents are suffering. Yes, that is true. As Min Chao mentioned, I do understand that the North Korean residents are going through difficulties. In the past, when there was a sanction and a restriction against North Korea, many people said that once the border is closed and the trade between North Korea and China is stopped, the North Korean economy cannot sustain for 100 days. There will be the collapse of the North Korean economy once there is the blockade of the trade between China and North Korea, according to many of the so-called North Korean experts. The trade between the two countries almost stopped. And after 1 year, what happened? Do you think that the North Korean economy is about to collapse? I do not think so. Of course, the North Korean citizens and the residents are suffering. However, the North Korean regime is working on the self-reliance strategy, and it somehow sustains the North Korean economy. Of course, at the cost of the suffering from the North Korean residents. The market and the Changmadang is shrunken and it is not functioning that well, and many of the jobs are gone for the North Korean residents. That's why the income level and the buying power of the North Korean resident is going down. It is true that the North Korean economy is slowing down. However, even with that, can we say this is a crisis? This is close to the collapse. I don't think there is no sign that the North Korean economy is about to collapse. The self-reliance of the North Korea is a kind of the fight against the sanction driven by the US. Of course, that does not make any sense for us. But what Kim Jong-un is saying is the sanction is driven by the US, and Kim Jong-un would like to prove that the sanction driven by the US is not effective. That is closely related to the North Korean nuclear issue, of course, at the cost of the suffering from the North Korean residents. Kim Jong-un somehow wants to recover the North Korean economy at any cost, and he wants to prove that this sanction is not working. And even at these difficult circumstances, North Korea wants to lower its reliance to China. North Korea wants to lower its reliance to the international aid and the foreign aid. COVID-19 is a kind of good excuse for North Korea, and they are kicking away the international aid under the excuse of the COVID-19. But what Kim Jong-un is envisioning is very ambitious. Okay, we can stop the trade, we can stop the getting the aid from the international society, but we can work with our want to feed. We can work on the self-reliance. That's what Kim Jong-un is envisioning right now. Of course, we need to wait and see. But again, when we talk about the North Korean economy, many people talked about that the North Korean economy is about to collapse. Many North Korean citizens are suffering from the famine. But when you take a look at the livelihoods of the North Korean residents, yes, they are suffering. However, still, they can somehow manage themselves. In the past, they can have the hot rice 3 times a day, but instead of the rice, they can eat corn, so they can somehow manage. So the North Korean residents are somehow managing themselves. But what matters is whether it's gonna get better or worse. That's something that we need to work on together.
Thank you. And any other panelists? What are the indicators of the crisis coming up in North Korea? Okay, so Min Chao and Brad.
Hi, I'll just go next. Mostly because I want to agree with Professor Lim and also provide maybe like an alternative perspective on when it comes to the effectiveness of the goods being blocked by North Korea. I have to say that all of my comments when it comes to North Korean Chinese trade is again limited to what we can see on public information released by China's General Administration of Customs. So of course there's smuggling or government sanctioned, but also hidden trade going on. And that's really been made possible throughout the pandemic period. We know that we know that Chinese government aid in terms of food, fertilizer, and other strategic goods has continued throughout the pandemic period. We also know that North Korean exports of coal to Chinese smuggling hotspots have also continued, and we can see that from shipping records. So in this way, China has not fully withdrawn, or there's not an absence of Chinese support or aid. It's just decreased significantly, especially in the private sector, as in like business to business trade. And I do want to actually show one thing, because there's one thing that North Korea can't do without, because it's a modern economy, and that's oil. Can you see my screen? Can you all see my screen?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Right. So North Korea doesn't produce any of its own oil. It doesn't have oil fields. It doesn't have oil supply, and it has a very limited capability for refining oil. So it receives all of its oil from China, Russia, used to be other countries, but now mostly from China and Russia. And these are the two countries that officially report exports to the United Sanctions 1718 Committee, as they're supposed to do due to UN sanctions. And officially, no oil exports have, no exports of refined petroleum have been sent to North Korea since October 2020. I literally find that to be impossible. So that probably comes from smuggling or some kind of unofficial trade that's making up that difference. But this is what official figures are telling us. But also that in such a strategic good like this, it's just a prime example of how self-reliance really cannot support the North Korean economy totally. North Korea is not isolated. It's still reliant on outside exports. And if this kind of activity continues, if reality begins to become closer to what these official reports say, then I really do think that North Korea is going to enter increasingly more desperate stages of crisis until we see some kind of breaking point.
Great point. And Brad?
Yeah, okay. I also subscribe to the fact that they're most likely to be in muddling through mode, pending whether there's some kind of a diplomatic breakthrough that would allow them a different trajectory of negotiations that could have a relatively rapid opening up part of it. But I think in the absence of that, and the absence of being able to have significant trade with China officially, they'll never get out of muddling through mode into a significant economic growth. I do think they know that there is so much inefficiency in the domestic economy that they can do things internally that can offset some of these external pressures. And there's incentive for them, partly because of sanctions, and of course now even more of COVID, to really embrace the reforms that will allow more efficient use of domestic resources. And they can get some mileage out of that, but they're not going to get sustained economic growth without trade and investment. And they need capital investment for infrastructure, which, you know, the 5-year plan was full of great ideas about major investments that just aren't going to happen unless those resources become available, and they're not going to be mobilized out of domestic income. So I think that there is a real constraint on aspiration. But I do think they're better positioned to muddle through, certainly, than in the 1990s, because they do have markets and they do have more incentive to make internal shifts from the military resources to support the domestic economy, which they're already doing. And I think China, despite the official statistics, is providing and willing to provide life support through unofficially announced trade or aid, and turning a blind eye to sanctions evasion that will allow them to muddle through. I don't think China will allow them to get to the point of absolute desperation. I do think a couple of indicators, you know, just because you asked for a couple. One that struck me recently was the fact that they had this cabinet meeting to talk about the first quarter performance and sort of get everybody motivated for the second quarter, but they didn't release any figures about how well they did. And I think no news is bad news coming from North Korea when they have a meeting like that. So that to me is an indicator that things are not going well, even against this year's lower expectation. And the second thing is, going back to the question of willingness to open up with foreign assistance. I think, like in, when Kim Jong-il opened up North Korea to the world, both in terms of NGOs, but official assistance from various countries in the mid-1990s, that was a game changer in many ways, in many levels. And if Kim Jong-un gets to the point where their economy is really not sustainable in his view in the current environment, the strategic choice you often hear people asking him to make would be to open up to at least human security kinds of relationships with the outside world, not just humanitarian assistance, but helping them really put their food security on a more sustainable basis in a health system that can not only overcome COVID, but can be more resilient for the people. That's an opening that he has available to him if he chooses to use it. And we don't know whether they get to the point where he feels that's something he's willing to do.
Thank you, Brad. Rachel, did you want to share what you saw in your crystal ball, or you want to just
I just
hide
wanted
it
to
from
build
us?
on- I just wanted to build on something that Dr. Babson said earlier about muddling through. I agree that Kim Jong-un is going to be in a muddling mode for as long as there is no real breakthrough in North Korea's relations with the US. I think Kim Jong-un understands that in order to truly and substantially improve the economy and for his reform measures to really bear fruit, that he is going to have to improve relations with the US, but he also has made it very consistently clear, he and North Korean officials like Choi Sun-hee, that they don't intend to lower the bar for resuming negotiations with the US. They've made that consistently clear since the breakdown of the working level talks with the US in Sweden in October 2019. So Kim Jong-un, while he needs an external environment that's favorable to rebuilding his economy, he is also bracing himself for a long-term confrontation with the US, where he cannot expect any sanctions relief. So in that sense, I think he is going to end up being more reliant on China, as we have seen since the collapse of the Hanoi summit. They've been aligning themselves closer and closer to China. And the fact that they appointed Lee Dong-nam, former trade minister, to be the next envoy to China. I think he's already there. I think that also speaks to the fact that North Korea really needs to ramp up trade with China. And I think so, more dependence on China going forward, I think.
Thank you. Let me open it up for Q&A. We have 15 minutes left. I'm sorry for for not doing the good job at time management, but the good news is I think our discussions already addressed some questions we have here. So let me pick the first question. This is from Carol Bodella from University of Central Lancashire. Besides the domestic response to North Korea's economic crisis, are remittances ameliorating the situation or offering new opportunities? So the money coming from the defectors or the North Korean workers in Russia, China, I guess.
Well, I can, oh, sorry.
Yes.
If you'd like to go, I think that Dr. Babson may have wanted to go.
All right, let me just say very quickly, I don't think remittances are a big deal right now for North Korea. The remittances they got from Koreans in Japan have been blocked by the Japanese government, and they've just extended their sanctions policy for another 2 years, I think today or yesterday. The remittances they've been receiving from overseas workers were addressed by the Security Council, and they've sent a lot of them home over the last few years. Some are stuck, unable to move. But with the pandemic impact on economies and travel and everything around the world, and the fact that even I think from South Korea, remittances are not doing as well as they used to. I don't think remittances are going to be very helpful for them in this situation. Others may have a different point of view.
I agree with Dr. Babson. I mean, we can think about how the money gets into North Korea, which is I'll save that for the second part of my comments. But the first part, the sanctioned environment has made it incredibly difficult for remittances to return. So, right, as Dr. Babson said, at the end of 2019, all overseas North Korean workers were supposed to have been sent home. Obviously, some still remain in places such as China, Russia. I just wrote an article about some stuck in Nigeria. They're also stuck there because of the inability of any foreigners, including North Korean nationals, to re-enter North Korea as of January 2020 because of the coronavirus pandemic. So they're still there. But their numbers have definitely decreased. So the amount of North Koreans sending net remittances back to North Korea has gone down. The economic impact on other types of people wanting to send remittances, such as Japanese or South Koreans back to North Korea, has also gone down because of people's economic hardship throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And then also the idea that US unilateral sanctions on banking industry, basically barring any the use of the US financial system and use of US dollars, because all of it has to go through correspondent banks, has diminished the ability of remittances to go back to North Korea. And that's how you send remittances back, unless you carry it by hand over the border, which is actually what some smugglers and what some remittance operatives do. At least for South Korean remittances, most of that was actually carried by cash in the accounts that I've read from China into North Korea. And as we know, there's no overland travel between North Korea and China along the border. We know that there is there have been statements made by USFK Commander Abrams about this policy of shoot on sight on the border, partially proven by the tragic killing of the South Korean Oceans and Fisheries employee last year. And I really don't see how remittances are getting into North Korea at this time.
Thank you. Our next question is from Fraser Ronald, Department of National Defense in Canada. How greatly have state-owned enterprises integrated into the informal economy for inputs and outputs? And how then could increased regime control or influence of that informal economy affect their performance? Yes, Ulchul?
북한의 이제 국영기업들은
And there are state-owned firms and the companies,
시장과의 연계 없이는
and without the link to the market,
기업을 운영할 수 없을
they
정도로
cannot operate the company.
시장에 많이 이제
So they are highly dependent on the market. And that's been the case for a long time.
북한의 이제 시장 경제가 워낙
Especially, the market economy has been widely expanding in North Korea. The state-owned companies and the private companies, well, you cannot actually distinguish which companies are state-owned and which companies are truly private companies. You cannot distinguish them.
또 사적 자본, 민간 기업이라고 할 수 있지만
And some of the companies can be private companies,
소속돼 있는 경우가 대부분이에요.
but sometimes they belong to the state-owned companies. And if you do not belong to the state-owned company, actually it is not fully allowed to do some of the individual economic activities. So once again, it is really difficult to distinguish between the private company and the state-owned company. The state-owned companies and the private companies and the market are trying to create the benefit and share the profit. State-owned companies in the past was effective and productive, and if they were not successful in the past, yes, even though they cannot meet the KPI, they were sustainable. However, there are lots of structural reform. Even the state-owned companies should meet the KPI, and if their sales or the revenue or the profit is not good, I mean, if they cannot meet the KPI, they can be restructured in the North Korean regime, which means there is a severe competition among the companies, even among the state-owned companies.
Thank you. Next question is from Mark Tokola. Is the collapse in imports solely because of COVID-19 restrictions, or might it be in part a lack of foreign exchange? Yes, Brad?
I think it's largely because of the closing of the border. Um, I mean, they are bringing things in by ship as opposed to by land, and they are finding ways to pay for them. You know, like ship-to-ship transfers of oil. Somebody has to pay for the oil, so there are ways that they're able to do business. But I think the major impact has been the COVID closure of the border on the ability to import into North Korea.
네,
Yes,
그
Ulchul?
이제 우리 밥 선생님 말씀에 동의하고요.
I fully agree with what Mr. Bobson said. Yes, the COVID-19 had a significant impact on the import volume. However,
북한이 아주 그러니까 국경을 완전히
North
폐쇄하지
Korea
않는
is not fully blocking its border.
필요한
Strategically, there are some of the strategic material, and those strategic materials and the goods are imported, and even relying on the smuggling itself, and they are officially importing some of the goods and materials as far as I understand. Let me give you some examples. And in the Pyongyang, they are starting to build lots of the houses for the residents. And they needed to import some of the materials from China, and some of the interior goods needs to be imported from China. And there are some core products like sugar and the seasoning. It's like a Beijing necessities. However, North Korea does not have the capability to produce those kind of Beijing necessities. Of course, they can somehow process the corn to make something sweet. However, they have the limitation. They cannot be the alternative for the sugar. Of course, the North Korea is strategically trying to have lower reliance on China.
Thank you. This question is from Albert Hong, Radio Free Asia. If the border, I think with China, is fully reopened, will the North Korean economy quickly revive? And I think this question relates to another question from Stephen Costello, non-resident visiting scholar at GWIKS. He also asked, what would be the impact of suspending the recent tight international sanctions on North Korea? Yes, Brad.
Yeah, I think, this is hypothetical and it is really relies on the assumption that the UN Security Council and the US government would be willing to roll back the most critically damaging sanctions that they put in place in 2017. I think if those were rolled back, it would have a rather significant initial supply response. Being able to export things for which there is actual business or commercial demand in China, and that is things like some of the minerals and coal that would be legitimized from what they've been doing in sanctions evasion, and a scale that would be larger if allowed, and the reestablishment of the textile trade, which was the second largest income earner after coal when those sanctions were imposed. And that would produce a lot of jobs and a lot of trade fairly quickly if it was allowed. So I think there would be a fairly rapid supply response, and it would be a good test of Kim Jong-un's economic management system changes to see how they adapt to that kind of a shift in the external environment.
Yes, Minchal?
Yeah, maybe this is a good time to break out the videos that I have of North Korean ship movements. I see that we only have 4 minutes left, so I'll try to make them quick. What I've been seeing is a tracker of AIS location data throughout the year is that it really died down in October and November 2020, but to address the question, ship activity has actually gone up in recent months, and North Korea's maritime fleet has basically been on hold and can be easily turned back on to support needed trade if North Korea ever decided to forego some of its pandemic restrictions or need for disinfection of goods or quarantine of goods, which we saw towards the beginning of the pandemic. So I'll just start my videos now.
How long is it? We have only 2 minutes left.
Oh no. I'll show you one video. So this one is, I'll show you one video. This one is from March, late March. So actually less than 2 weeks ago. That's here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so perfect. This is October, November. Oops, don't want this one. And this one is late March 2021. Just some points that I want to make. If you can see my mouse, all of this is coal smuggling. Movements along here are basically ship-to-ship transfers, ship-to-ship movements along the East Coast because infrastructure has been destroyed. And as you can see, activity is actually pretty high compared to where it was in October, November. If you subscribe to NK News, you can also see all these videos, which I do every month.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. This is from Bill Brown. North Korea hasn't imported significant machinery from China in 3 years. Is that hitting the North Korean industry? Are the factories operating well?
Actually, I can respond to this partially because it actually touches on Minyoung, one of Minyoung's statements about the Pyongyang General Hospital. So we know that trade in machinery, even though it has been banned under UN sanctions, has been going on mostly through transshipping through China. However, there are some machines that just can't get through. And those are, in the case of Pyongyang General Hospital, really high value medical devices that the government has been trying to seek to make the Pyongyang General Hospital like this star project. So that includes like high-end Zeiss, like X-ray machines, or I'm not a doctor, so I actually don't know how to describe these machines, but they're very expensive, and they've had trouble sourcing, which is, according to our sources, why they haven't opened the hospital yet, because the outside is completely finished, but the inside is not stocked with these machines at all. And in case of other machinery that could support the missile program, it's possible such things are getting through. The most recent panel of experts report did discuss on exchanges of equipment as well as expertise to North Korea during in recent years and also the 2020 period.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, thank you. With that, let me conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank all the panelists for sharing their excellent insights. And I'd also like to thank our technical team for putting this together, and Mr. Junho Lee for his excellent simultaneous translation. And thank you all for joining us. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.